Howdy, I'm Dana Lawson, CTO of Netlify, and I am so excited to have this LinkedIn Live talk with you today. And today I'm joined by the two Matts. But first up, Matthew Phillips, CTO of Astro, and Matt Billman, CEO of Netlify. Thanks for joining me, you guys.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hopefully you know why you're tuned in live to this LinkedIn event. But today we're going to be talking about how to make the web simpler. Companies are working to make the entire web ecosystem stronger through tighter collaborations, high value features, and powerful assisted development experiences. And with that, I think you all know comes growing complexity in how we build for the web. But I'm here to say it doesn't have to be that way. So let's talk about that. I know that Matthew, Matt, and myself, we have been thinking about this problem probably most of our career, some of us a little bit longer than others, but I won't blame myself for being late to the web party. With that being said, I'm curious, Matt Billman, and I'm sure the rest of our viewers are, like, how are you thinking about bringing down some of this complexity with the rise of all this amazing technology behind web development?
Well, first I want to talk a little bit about just what I think about when I say complexity and simplicity. I think one of my favorite talks on it is like this talk from years ago by the creator of a programming language called Closure, Rich Hickey, that gave a really seminal talk called like Simple Made Easy, where he kind of really built like this distinction between things that are easy. Like you can click a button and have some generator spit out 2 million files that gives you like a website, and you push it online somewhere, and that's pretty easy. But it's not simple because you now have like 2 million files you need to understand, and you don't know what it did, so you have no idea what's in there. Or you can have like things in the from my past, like you can build stuff with like a purely functional programming language like Haskell, and like be deep in like the type theory of it and so on. In some ways it's definitely not easy and can be like hard to grok. But on another level, it's like very simple because you have these like completely stateless, composable building blocks of pure functions, and every bit of code can be reasoned about in isolation, right? Like, so I think when we talk about like how to make the web simpler, it's good to not just like think about it in terms of how to make it easy, but also how do we make what we are building as front-end developers simple to understand and reason about. Like, and I think when I think about that, I always think about like, how do we get smaller blocks of things that we can think about in isolation versus big monolithic things where you have to understand all that goes into the thing at the same time to sort of be able to do something with it. So that's like one thought on simple and complex. The other thought is like, I think some years ago when people were asking me about this, and like people are always complaining about complexity, right? Like, so some years ago when people saying, oh, front end is getting so complex, my answer was sort of, but what you can build as a front end developer today is also like just amazing.
Yeah.
Like it's like, sure, it's gotten more complex, but you can like build like these globally distributed real-time multiplayer apps from your laptop in like seconds, and it's pretty amazing. And I still think there's some of that, but on the other hand, I think it feels a little bit to me that in the last 3 years or 4 years, maybe, like that complexity has kept growing without the things we build on the web actually changing that much, right? Like, so I also think about like, sometimes complexity can be worth it if it really lets us do something fundamentally new. But if we add complexity and we're doing the same things, then it feels like we're really doing something wrong. We should like rein that in so we can spend sort of our complexity budget on new things that makes a difference.
I think that's what all developers want, you know, and I love the separation of complexity or simplicity and ease, right? I think that really for us, and the way I think about is simplifying is, again, easy to understand, but not necessarily easy to do. And if we think of the evolution of where we started and where we're at, you're right. It is incredible. Some of the new functionality we never thought was possible, and some of the things that have been unlocked with these frameworks, and Astro being in the hot center of it all. Matthew, how are you thinking about this? I mean, y'all are at the forefront of really tackling this problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is like something I've been thinking about most of my career, actually. I've always been someone who liked like the simple composable things. I like building blocks, you know, that's always been kind of a passion. I don't know where that really comes from, but that's just all what I always wanted to have. So as the web has evolved to be more complex, it's like I have this like push and pull between like, oh, I know these things which are more complex are like good in certain ways, but I really just want to like take little parts of things and like build my own thing. It's funny, this is like kind of my talk a little bit. This topic is like a lot of my talk. What I don't know, have we mentioned Compose at all?
We haven't mentioned Compose, but we should do it right now. Matthew's given an amazing talk October 2nd, 3rd at Netlify's developer conference, Compose, at the Fairmont, San Francisco. So anybody watching, you're going to get a little sneak preview from Matthew right now. But you know, come join us. Come hear what he really has to say about it. But Matt, Matthew, why don't we give a little sneak into what you're thinking about here, man?
Yeah, well, Matt has like made some really good points that aren't in my talk, and I'm kind of upset about that. So I need to find a way to fold some of those things in. But I guess when I think about complexity, like I like to go back to like how we got here, because if you understand how we got here, then it's easier to kind of untangle things, I think. And from a framework standpoint, I have this kind of thesis, and I'm interested if it's true on the platform side as well. But on the framework side, which I've been involved in frameworks for over 10 years now, what really happened was in the kind of like mid-odds. Is that how you say that? Mid-odds.
I think so. I think that's right.
The 2000s. Yeah. That's kind of when people started building more complicated applications, things like Gmail, Google Maps, those things come to mind. There was actually one particular application. I don't know if you'll remember Google Wave. Do you all remember that?
Oh,
yeah.
Matt, I'm sure. Okay. Google Wave was like this advanced kind of like email sort of thing. It was written in Java.
Built by Danes.
Oh, really? Okay. That's right. Yes.
There you go.
Forgot about that. Yes. Written in Java, compiled to JavaScript. So that was like, to me, that's when I think about that as a milestone of like, oh, you can actually build real things on the web. And then frameworks kind of adapted from there. And in the early days, people, you know, we had jQuery, which is very popular, still very popular. And, you know, people were used to building, you know, small bits of things on the web using jQuery, small bits of like interactivity. And eventually those same people were like, oh, you know, I have a client that wants me to build a dashboard or some type of little small app. Okay, I'm going to use jQuery. And that's kind of how we got Backbone. The early versions of Ember all used jQuery. CanJS was another. And they're all built kind of, you know, with that as a primitive, but giving more structure, right? And so that kind of evolved. And then we got into components, and that's kind of where we've been since. And with components, really templating as the kind of core thing I think about. Templating allows you to like think about your application in a declarative fashion, which is like super valuable. But this is all focused on building like kind of rich applications. And I think a lot of developers are used to this sort of like apps versus websites debate. And like, there's a lot of truth to that, but there's a lot of like stuff in the middle, right? It's not just those two extremes. So everyone building frameworks at the time were kind of going to the extreme of like, I want to like build the most complicated, most, you know, interactive thing possible. And then teams started adopting this, right? Like teams were building their dashboards with it. And those same team members, when, you know, maybe they work for an e-commerce company and the e-commerce company said, hey, let's rebuild our website. Oh, let's use this thing, this framework that we're used to, that we're very productive in. Let's use that same thing here. And then they were like, and then those same developers were like, well, I'm going to build a blog. I'm going to use that as well. And so you kind of got this thing where frameworks, more advanced frameworks, got pushed into, you know, down the stack into more quote unquote simple cases. And frameworks then tried to evolve to accommodate that, but they evolved backwards, right? They evolved from the most complicated things to try to make it possible to build more simple things. And it didn't go in the opposite direction. And I feel like a lot of complexity comes from that sort of history. in that, we started with something complex and we try to make it more simple, but you can't really do that. So I think you kind of have to go in the other direction. So it's a very long-winded way of saying that's how I think about it from the perspective of Astro. Whereas Astro and other tools like 11D, for example, were really built as sort of a backlash against the complexity. We're kind of built as sort of like, let's bring things back. Let's get back to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And there's a lot of backlash against the frameworks, but now we're kind of pushing in the other direction. So that's kind of how I think about it.
It makes me think of, and I know, like, if you've been around for a hot minute, that old before memes, XV cartoon of like the tire swing and look at the engineer and how they created the over engineered tire swing. If you haven't seen that, it's an oldie but a goodie.
It's a good one.
Go Google it. But I think about that a lot too. I was an early jQuery adopter. I'm like $ for life. Why? It really comes down to like, what are you trying to build? And I think you have a great point there, Matthew, is when we started coming out with these frameworks and these web tools and these different web development styles, we started just piling it all into one way of doing the work, when actually it really depends on what you're trying to build. And you're right, there's that forever struggle of websites versus apps and what we need to be able to produce those experiences. And I think there's a real thing that's missing when we think about how can we continue this journey of like what you're doing at Astro, what we're doing here at Netlify, and simplifying is understanding of the importance of choosing the right framework, the right platform from what you're trying to accomplish. It shouldn't be this Frankenstein bundle of code just built upon. But let's be clear, that's how the internet started. We've all dealt with our own Frankenstein monsters of stacks. I think we all have battle wounds from building some very interesting things. I mean, I implemented IBM WebSphere back when it first came out. Talk about taking you back in time. Google Wave. Oof. But with that, I'm curious, Matt, how are we looking at that between the frameworks, the platform, and the primitives on solving those answers for these developers as they think about actually what they're building? Like, how do we lead developers to choosing the right thing for their problem? How are you thinking about that, Matt?
I mean, one way is to think about like the main platform, right? Like, which is the web platform, which if you're building for the web, inherently that's like the core set of primitives you're kind of given and aligned towards, right? Like, and I think there's sometimes some approaches that tries to completely abstract that away and give you sort of a whole alternative world that feels easier. And then obviously, like, if you just take like no framework, vanilla, JS, HTML, CMS, CSS, and so on, and try to build like then probably also like it's often too hard to build the experiences you want. But I think if I think back to that initial distinction of like easy or simple, to me that when it comes to building for the web, it's only really simple if it's also relatively simple to understand how it actually maps onto that underlying web platform. If the abstraction between what you're doing and what is in the actual platform starts getting too big, then you might be able to make things easy, but you also end up in that situation where as a developer, like reasoning about what's really happening starts getting a lot harder, right? Like, and where even as like these different things evolve, you're learning sort of a parallel platform instead of actually learning the core platform you're building for, right? Like, so for me, it's always been important to always see like what's the best way to align with the web platform and what it's trying to do. What's the best way to lean in on the primitives that exposes, but still make them easier to adopt and use where we can. And it's one of the things I've really liked in general with a lot of the work you all have done on Astro and so on, right? Like that it always felt very like leaning into the web platform in a way rather than trying to build a parallel platform, right? Like more like, hey, how do we actually make it easy to build with this platform?
Yeah, I mean that's what we're trying to do. I'm glad that comes through. Right. I think that, yeah, I mean when you one problem when you build with what you call a parallel platform is when you as a developer, you only have access to the things that platform, that framework, whatever it is, it gives you access to. And there's a whole bunch more stuff that you don't easily have access to. So you kind of lose that degree of flexibility. And the web is such a difficult thing to build for that, the expectation of users, the number of devices that people have, like giving up any degree of flexibility, you fall into a trap inevitably. Either they make it too easy to add too much JavaScript and then it doesn't work in like low-end devices. Those sorts of things. So yeah, with Astro, we wanted to like kind of go in the middle between, hey, frameworks are great and they make a lot of things much more simple, but how can we do it in a way where we empower you to like start with the basics, start with basic HTML, JavaScript, and then kind of pull those things in as needed, rather than making them the center of everything that you do. That way you still have the flexibility when you need to. And we see this all the time with users, by the way. Like we see from users that, people who are new to Astro, they start off and they're like, okay, well, I'm a React developer. I'm going to bring a bunch of React things in. And then they're like, they kind of get a rush off of like finding ways to remove those. They're like, wait a second, this button is just like updating this thing over here. Let me just write a little inline script that does that. And so you do have the flexibility. You can start off one particular way and then make things simpler. Or on the other hand, you can start with like, I'm going to write a complicated script, and then you're like, oh gosh, I can't understand this anymore. Like now's a good time for me to bring in a framework.
I definitely agree. And I think that kind of comes with the thinking too of that ability to have that control to build on when you need versus, I think about, the classic engineering problem of like, before we had feature flags, it was like all on, right? You just turn everything on. And it's a similar thing. And I think there's this opportunity to go and put the right pieces that you in and be intentional about it. And it's interesting also like how people are just utilizing some of these modern development platforms to make those decisions on their behalf. And I think it's an interesting intersection on how we see development just as building blocks. And I really believe that a lot of us still want that composability and that control, because it's about the ease of understanding how you're going to put it together versus like just flipping everything on. But I'm going to tell you, I do also get that rush of like turning it off, because it's just like, oh, it feels so good to optimize your code. I mean, it just feels so damn good. And you usually don't get to do that until you've made it really complex and then you're coming back through. And I think it's interesting how you can meet both those needs, because sometimes when you're in that experimentation loop, you're like, I don't know yet. And maybe I need to go have all these things. But again, adding just the little bits of JavaScript as you go, it keeps that agile mindset. And I think that's what we really want to continue to do, is unlock developers to add what they need and not spend all the capital just continuously going, oh, wait a minute, this is overkill. And now I have to go and do performance optimization. Because to your point, the internet's getting harder. There's more devices, there's more channels, there's more things you have to think about to create those digital experiences. Wait till stuff's just floating in the air and holographs. Those are going to be hard websites, but it's coming, y'all. We haven't even talked about that in a hot minute. But I'm curious, how are you also thinking about the future of this? What are you doing right now? I know Astro, y'all been thinking about, you've implemented server islands. You're thinking about, again, like how can we continue to empower but simplify? Is there any other things that maybe you can give us some insight into what's coming up?
Yeah, totally. I think server islands a great one to talk about, but backing up a second, like I talked about how frameworks evolved, and what I see as happening now is kind of we start off with a very like one size fits all model, and then we started having frameworks which are specialized. We have frameworks specifically for blogs and those sorts of things. So now what I think is going to happen, and one thing we're trying to do with Astro is make a framework that can expand to specific use cases, because there's so many different use cases on the web. As Matt said, they haven't really changed over time though, right? And they're all the same things more or less. So something like e-commerce, that's what Server Islands is created for. If you're building an app, like a full app, you don't really need to know about it. So we want to build these sorts of features in a way where when you need them, they're there, but we don't want to like force this knowledge on you when that's not the type of thing you're building. So server islands, your audience, I'm sure has no idea what that is. maybe I should back up just a second and explain islands in general.
Islands.
There you go.
So yeah, so islands, Astro. So if you're familiar with traditional frameworks, something like a Next.js, what they do is they take over the entire page, and the entire page becomes a single page application. Next.js has kind of changed that, I think partially based off of some stuff we're doing. We'll see. But anyways, islands is a way to take the full page and you just add the interactivity that you have as an island. You know, like say, for example, you have some type of weather widget or something on your page, that becomes an island. You have like some login information the user can customize, you know, their theme or whatever, that becomes an island. And so instead of like building the entire page as a full application, you build the entire thing as pure HTML, and then you kind of add the interactivity kind of where you need it. That is what an island is. Server island kind of takes that same concept but applies it to server rendering.
Mm-hmm.
So if people that know Astro, like kind of known as a static site generator, that's not just what we're about, but that is a big part of it. And so a server island says, hey, I want to, this entire page is for something like e-commerce, can be highly cached, right? Like everyone in the world is going to see the same, you know, scuba gear product. Why did I think of scuba? I don't know. Everyone's going to see that same product. But everyone also maybe has a different, you know, you have comments, and that's completely dynamic, or you have some sales items, and those are specific to your location or something like that. So you have these parts that are personalized to a particular user, while the outer shell is not. And so a server island is a way to allow you to define those kind of pieces, which are for personalized content. Those are going to render on the server, but it's not going to slow down the rest of the page. So you get the product immediately. The user sees it immediately. It can be cached very quickly on Netlify CDN, very, very fast. And then you go to the server for those dynamic bits, and those still come in very fast. And we try to optimize those. But yeah, server island is like one of those things that I'm talking about, where it's created for e-commerce. I mean, not just e-commerce, but that is like one kind of specific use case.
And you know what? I think it still fits into this realm of like, there are going to be these differences, right? And I love that approach of really understanding, again, is it e-commerce? Is it healthcare? What are you building these websites and applications for? And Matt Billman, you again have thought about this a lot too, this isolation, this hyper-personalization. I dream about caching and only rendering the stuff we need, because who doesn't love an amazing first time to bite? But Matt Billman, like, you know, you've been really engrossed in this. Like, you've been talking about this kind of technology. And I think this, again, unlocks the ease of use and the simplicity of building these sites, because now you can go and pick and choose the things you need and not have to do all of it. What are your thoughts there, and how you're approaching some of this handoff as people build these websites, having a global edge network, having some of the primitives and the web platform capabilities outside the framework?
So there's a couple of parts to this, right? Like, one thing is, I think about simplifying, that's been one of sort of the core tenets when we started Netlify, was like to build a pretty strict like chasm between the actual front end web technologies and then whatever you're doing on the back end. Because before that, like, on the one hand, as Matthew said, right, like there's the sense that like actually like the difference from content driven side or an e-commerce or some applications is more of a spectrum than like a binary. And yet before like we started decoupling the front end from the back end, you would typically have a completely different stack for each of those, right? Like, because you would take an e-commerce platform, and since it had all the logic for e-commerce and everything, like the front end was sort of like derived from that, and you would definitely not take that stack and build like a marketing site with it, right? Like, or on the other hand, you might take like an application framework, and sure, sometimes you might even build a marketing site with that, but it's definitely not the right thing to do, right? Like, and it's funny because like sort of one of the seminal projects back in the day where we demonstrated like the benefits of sort of really separating these two pieces was this whole like project we did with Smashing Magazine back in 2016, 2017, where we helped them re-architect sort of their whole stack to this modern Jamstack approach. And exactly based on that world where they had Shopify for their e-commerce, and they had WordPress for their main magazine and blog, and they had a Ruby and Rail app for their job board, and then they had some other kind of CMS for their event page that was built for that, right? Like, and each of those had a different template engine, right? Like, so you had like Liquid and Shopify, and you had PHP and WordPress, and you had ERP in Ruby and Rails, and something third in like the last one, right? Like, and as they were trying to figure out how to construct like one new brand on top of all of that, it was just like, whoa, we got to implement it now in like 4 different templates and all these different monolithic applications and so on, right? Like, so that was one, like, just one of these demonstrations of like, hey, we can actually, if we break that constraint of like your front end being dependent on that backend system and just build it on its own, it's much easier to span that whole gamut, right? Like, and I think now we're seeing some frameworks sort of really try to go back to be like monolithic full stack, and I can understand like the power that comes from that, but I'm pretty positive that you can get a lot more freedom by saying like let's keep a barrier between them and treat the actual web stuff as something that needs to be really close to the tooling we have as the core web platform.
Yeah.
And build with it. And it was really interesting to see that project with Smashing Magazine was like way before this culture was coined and so on, was definitely built with an island architecture, right? Like, we statically generated all their article pages and everything, right? Like, and then had like a mini little like jQuery based system for like swapping in React components in the right places to be like, hey, the shopping cart is an island. They're like, the search is an island of interactivity. And then even, as you said, some full single page apps, right? Like when you went to the checkout, that was like a new page, but like that took over like just a single page app for the whole checkout flow and so on, right? Like, and I think back then, since like this is where I think the framework can really help, right? Like, because back then that was, again, that is actually a really simple mental concept, right? Like, once you get it and think about it like that, you get like this static guarantees of the things that really just content driven, where from a platform provider we know exactly when something changes and needs to be invalidated. There's not like super complexity and building all the caching rules around it, and so it's like a very simple model. It's very simple to get it on the edge and in front of people. And on the other hand, on the pieces that are like interactive, you know that they're different and should behave different, and you can insert them into the page and so on, right? Like, but at the time, it was definitely not easy because there was no guideline on how to do it, right? Like, you just had to figure it all out, right? Like, so I think the power of this island approach is really to make it easy. And then what we're trying to do is in Netlify, and the flip side is to really come up with the right sort of simple abstraction around like the core primitives for our platform and how that maps onto the web, the core primitives around caching, the core primitives around like dynamic request and responses, the core primitives around edge transformations or things like that, right? Like, and make those like not framework derived in a way where you just have to figure out what happens in all this magic below, but also hopefully fairly simple to understand on their own as well documented primitives, and 100%. Then hopefully create a really great place to collaborate with the people that are then building the use, like the DX from the framework side on top of all of that.
I agree. And, we're coming down to the wire, folks. So that is a lot of context in 29 minutes. But before we go, I want Matthew to share some exciting news that Astro has landing. Matthew, please tell the viewers what you got happening.
All right, yeah. So we're releasing Astro 5 soon. We hope to get it out by the end of the year. Yeah, version 5. Where I think that makes us a mature framework. I think that's what it means. So we have a beta. We just released the beta on Tuesday, so that's now available. It has server islands, which I just talked about. We also have content layer, which is a really great feature. It's a great way to allow you to like pull in content from like external CMSs, things like Storyblock, and it could be from the GitHub API, whatever. Pull that down into your Astro site. So those are kind of our 2 big features. The beta is out, so check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope to see you guys live at the Compose Conference October 2nd and 3rd in San Francisco. And come hit that Compose LI50 discount code to come hang with us. Thank you again for your time today. And it was great chatting with y'all.